In the CTMU, logic is defined up to the point where it provides the means of its own processing and configuration. This involves a geometry. Logic communicates with itself through internal parts and supports its own grammatical evolution and syntactic specification, which are the logical equivalent of time and space. Through the self-duality of the CTMU, the external geometric aspect of reality is coupled with the linguistic internal processing, providing logic with a geometry enabling communication between its parts. The mereology of the CTMU places the system evolution under the identity of the global operator descriptor, or God. As a result, the geometry emerging from logic becomes a fundamental aspect that God uses to structure itself and reality. God has a geometry. What is the geometry of God? The CTMU presents its geometry of God through the concept of conspansion. Conspansion, or material contraction qua spatial expansion, is the fundamental process of evolution of reality. The CTMU identifies reality as a conspansive manifold, i.e., syntactors undergoing conspansion. Syntactors are the linguistic active components combining both time and space, i.e., their grammar and syntax. Conspansion is the two-phase process that all of reality undergoes to continually refresh syntactors and identify itself via syntactors. Inner expansion and requantization are the two phases of the process. Conspansion enables communication between the local syntactors via an inner expansion. Local syntactors have inner expansive domains that mutually absorb the syntax of their neighbors. The syntax of syntactors interpenetrate and allow for the interaction between the two objects. From the local vantage point, the inner expansive domain, or IED, can be seen as a sphere growing and providing opportunity to every object inside it to interact with the object syntax included in the inner expansive domain. Through that process of locally spreading the linguistic process, Conspansion also provides a more general communication framework between syntax and state at the level of the global syntax of reality. During the two phases, globality goes through descriptive containment of itself. Reality is described by these inner expansive domains, and topological containment, where the syntax collapses to specific points. Where does the geometry emerge? Each logical object being the quantum wave function of a particle or a more complex syntactic aggregate nucleating such particles can be said to have a syntactic boundary. The boundary contains the laws and programming embedded inside the object. As far as the object is concerned, my understanding is that the boundary is its universe, and time is just an ordinal evolution of its boundary, i.e. the emergence of a new state and new syntax. Boundary is a word that has a spatial connotation, but my understanding is that it is not just a timeless instant. It encodes the past of the object, layering all of its history inside the boundary, while also containing the syntax that the object uses as potential for its future. The boundary can be understood as the entire timeline of the object, that can be further layered to new timelines based on conspansive cycles. The boundary of the object contains the syntax of the object, but the global syntax is available in the boundary of the object, allowing the syntactic nucleation of the lower level objects into more complex objects. A man can be made of many particles because it shares the global syntax, allowing him to be nucleated by the particles. The global syntax available within each object is what maintains the geometry of Conspansion by granting syntactic interpenetration of all local objects with their surrounding neighbors. The global syntax has access to all the objects and ensure that the geometry is globally consistent and available to all objects. The time of the object, or the successive definition of its local reality, occurs as an internal writing of syntax within its boundary, layering new spacetime events within the object. The location of the object is a state that parameterizes the inner expanding events, during which all objects absorb the syntax of their neighbors. So inner expansion is the first phase of Conspansion, allowing each local reality to share its processing rules and state potential with its neighbors, and also more generally to the global syntax. Requantization is the second phase of Conspansion, where two or more objects collapse their inner expansive domain into a new event, inheriting all of this syntax, rules, and timelines, and creating a new geometric point of inner expansion. So all the objects that got requantized together start to communicate their history and syntax from that new local point. That's the output phase of reality, where it becomes topologically contained, while the inner expansion occurs at the production phase, where reality configures its next state. That's where the geometry comes from. Particles and all kinds of objects expand, then requantize and expand from a new point. The rate at which geometrical interpenetration, inner expansion occurs is a global system parameter. Langan then identifies the rate of inner expansion as c, the speed of light in a vacuum. Because the geometry occurs only in the objects, writing timelines inside themselves, Langan says that the universe is not expanding into anything. Movement is not an ectomorphism mapping objects inside an external background space, but an endomorphism mapping the objects inside their own syntax. The phenomenon of the expansion of the universe, according to this view, is material content shrinking down according to all the syntactors that recognize content. Everything agrees that everything gets smaller. For example, the extension of my arm to reach an object is an expression of the size of my material content. Let's say now that I want to grab an object, and first I managed to do it, but then I cannot do it a second time. The contraction of material content of the Conspansion means that if without any other forces, the object becomes unreachable nevertheless, it is not because the object has been mapped further inside the background space, or because empty space has been created between the object and me, but it is because both my arm and the object shrinked and internally rescaled all the laws, including the speed of light, to the new shrinked set of objects. I feel I am extending my arm in the same way as before, there is general preservation of the laws or general covariance, but all the objects agreed that everything was shrinking, so now the object is too far for me to reach because my arm has become too small. This geometry does not rely on any external background space, but is coupled with a linguistic description of the universe inside each object. What that does is that space is included inside the object themselves. The consequence is that when objects move through space, it is a discrete quantum process. The world lines of the objects are retrodicted, but the object does not go through a background space at every point. It all occurs according to inner expansion and requantization. In conclusion, Conspansion is the global process by which objects interpenetrate and assemble into new laws, state, and syntax to express their identity. It enables at the global level the global descriptive containment of God and also its topological containment. It reflects the geometry of God through the two phases of inner expansion and requantization. God achieves global and local identification without the need of an external space, but only with objects logically receiving the global syntax and following conspansive cycles. The expansion of space within God is the contraction of the size of the objects within God, because God has no space to expand into. God is not in space or time, but time and space are in God and its sub-identities.